Before we begin, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy sharp, emotional stories about pride, second chances, family tension, and the kind of revenge that arrives without warning, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city or country you're listening from, because what happened to me started as an awkward wedding invitation and ended as the moment 20 years of quiet disrespect finally came due. My name is Adrian Vega. I'm 53 years old, and I write music for films. Not the giant blockbuster franchises with exploding cities and caped heroes, but intimate dramas, festival films, and the kind of projects critics admire while the general public barely notices. At least that was true for most of my life. Years ago, before everything changed, I was still the man everyone politely described as talented but unstable. Back then, my ex-wife, Clara, was already climbing fast in the banking world. She believed in strategy, control, and safety. I believed in work that meant something, even if it took longer to pay off. When our marriage broke apart in the late 2000s, the global economy was shaking, companies were collapsing, and fear had seeped into every conversation about the future. I was finishing the score for a documentary no one expected to make real money from when Clara stood in the doorway of my studio and told me she was done. She said she needed certainty. She said she was tired of living beside a man still chasing a dream. The way she said dream made it sound childish, almost embarrassing. I told her my music covered my share of the bills, which was technically true, though we both knew her executive salary at a major financial group was carrying far more weight than my work. Then she brought up our daughter, Lucia, who was still a child at the time. She talked about college, retirement, long-term planning, the future of a family that, in her mind, I was not protecting properly. Clara had always lived 10 steps ahead of the present. It made her excellent at restructuring troubled companies, and, as it turned out, equally efficient at dismantling a troubled marriage. I didn't beg her to stay. Maybe part of me understood that by then she had already rewritten the story of our life together. In her version, she was the practical woman who had outgrown an irresponsible artist. After the divorce, I moved into a cramped apartment in another part of the city, put my piano in the middle of the living room because there was nowhere else it would fit, and poured myself completely into my work. Clara kept rising. A vice president became a director, then eventually the chief financial officer of a major private bank. Lucia split her time between us, though as she grew older, she seemed more comfortable in my cluttered place full of manuscripts, cables, and unfinished melodies than in Clara's elegant, sterile house in the hills. Then, years later, one score changed everything. It was for a modest period film about a jazz pianist in a coastal city in the 1960s. I gave that project everything I had ever carried inside me. Every humiliation, every sacrifice, every quiet moment of doubt. When it won a major international award for Best Original Score, my life turned overnight. Suddenly, I wasn't just Adrian Vega, the struggling composer. I was Adrian Vega, the award-winning composer producers wanted in their meetings, directors trusted with their most personal films, and studios were willing to pay well. I launched my own production company, made smart investments, and turned what everyone once dismissed as a fragile career into a serious business. The irony was impossible to miss. The path Clara had treated as reckless ended up making me wealthier than either of us had once imagined. But she never really acknowledged that. At least not openly. So when I received a formal invitation to her wedding to Esteban Salazar, a venture capitalist with polished manners, political ambitions, and the kind of smile that always looked rehearsed, I stared at it for a long time. Lucia had mentioned him before. She said he treated every room like a campaign event and every person like a useful contact or an inconvenience. She also told me he looked at me during family functions as if I were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of an expensive shoe. I should have thrown the invitation away. Nothing good was likely to come from attending. And yet curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was that, or maybe some stubborn part of me wanted to see what Clara's face would look like when she had to confront the fact that the man she once left behind had not only survived, but built the exact life he wanted on his own terms. So I RSVP'd yes. The wedding took place on a warm September evening at a private rooftop venue above a luxury hotel in the capital. One of those spaces people only get into through status, influence, and invisible networks. The setting was pure Clara. Flawless floral arrangements, Soft lighting, crystal everywhere. Waiters moving silently through clusters of wealthy guests speaking in low, self-important voices. I had barely stepped out of the elevator when Lucia found me. She was 20, radiant, and wearing a pale gold bridesmaid dress that made her look far more composed than I felt. She hugged me, half surprised I had actually come. I told her I wouldn't have missed it, which was only partly true. She rolled her eyes when I asked about her mother and said Clara had been micromanaging everything for weeks. Then I asked about the groom. Lucia said he was somewhere in the crowd, probably pitching himself to future donors, advisors, or voters. She had never liked him. He had tried buying her approval with expensive gifts and elite introductions, but she saw straight through him. A few minutes later, I spotted Clara's younger brother, Matteo, the only person from her family who had remained warm with me after the divorce. Matteo hugged me like no time had passed and immediately warned me that Esteban had been asking why I was invited at all. He also told me something more interesting. Apparently Esteban had been telling people all evening that I was basically a failed music teacher who never really made anything of himself. According to Matteo, Clara had never corrected him. Before I could react, Clara approached with Esteban at her side. She looked beautiful in the precise, immaculate way she always preferred, elegant, controlled, unreachable. For 1 second, when our eyes met, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Regret, maybe not. Then the social smile returned. Esteban stepped forward, shook my hand, and gave me the kind of condescending charm ambitious men mistake for sophistication. "So you're the ex-husband," he said. "Clara told me you work in music." That was his opening shot. I smiled and said, "Something like that." Clara shifted awkwardly and clarified that I composed for films, but she said it in the smallest possible way, as if my career were still a niche curiosity. Esteban asked whether I had worked on anything he might have heard of, and before I answered, Lucia stepped in with perfect timing. She said, "My father won one of the biggest awards in film music a few years ago, and his company just closed a major streaming deal this summer." Esteban's expression cracked for a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, but I saw it. He had expected a man he could dismiss. Instead, he had run into someone he hadn't bothered to understand. Clara redirected the conversation immediately and told Lucia to show me to my table. On the way there, Lucia quietly apologized. She said Esteban had spent weeks describing me as an impractical nobody who never succeeded in the real world, and her mother had allowed that version of me to stand. I wasn't seated at the main family table, but I wasn't banished either. It was the kind of placement meant to look polite while keeping me carefully out of the center. Matteo joined me, amused by the entire thing, and pointed out that half the room was now trying to decide whether I was the same Adrian Vega they knew from the entertainment press. I let them wonder. The ceremony itself was beautiful, and strangely, I felt no bitterness while watching it. Clara looked certain, Esteban looked triumphant, and as they exchanged vows, I felt only a distant sadness for the version of us that had once existed long before ambition hardened everything. We had loved each other once. We had also wanted fundamentally different lives, and there are some differences love alone cannot bridge. At the reception, the real tension began. I stayed mostly at the edges with a whiskey in hand, watching the machinery of status at work. This was Clara's kingdom now. Executives, donors, strategists, people who never spoke plainly unless it benefited them. Matteo joined me on the terrace and said the whole environment had never truly been Clara's either, at least not originally. He wondered aloud whether people really change or simply become better at performing what the world rewards. Before I could answer, we noticed Lucia across the room in a tense conversation with Esteban near the gift table. Her posture was rigid, his finger was cutting through the air, and I could tell from the distance alone that he was trying to overpower her. I crossed the room and arrived in time to hear him criticizing her upcoming summer internship at my studio. He wanted her to abandon it and work with his campaign network instead, where, according to him, she could build a serious future. Lucia told him he knew nothing about me. He fired back that he knew enough. A man who had chosen artistic self-indulgence over providing stability. I asked whether there was a problem. He said it was a family matter that no longer concerned me. I told him my daughter would always concern me. Lucia explained that Esteban believed her plans were beneath her potential. I answered that Lucia was an adult and had every right to make her own decisions. Esteban insisted that Clara and he only wanted what was best for her, by which he meant a respectable path, not following me into an unconventional life. 20 years earlier, that kind of contempt might have cut me. Once, I had wondered whether Clara was right to leave, whether my stubbornness had cost my family too much. But success, especially success earned honestly over time, burns away a lot of that old confusion. I told Esteban my unconventional life seemed to have worked out rather well. He replied that passion is easy to romanticize when you aren't responsible for others. Lucia stepped in sharply and reminded him that even in my leanest years, I had never missed support payments, never skipped a recital, never failed to show up when she needed me. I stopped her before the argument spiraled further, and she went outside for air. That left Esteban and me alone. He told me the arts were a hobby, not a real career. I smiled and told him to say that to my accountant. He dismissed my success as luck, a single lightning strike, and said Lucia deserved better than gambling her future on long odds. I told him what she deserved was to be surrounded by people who believed in her ability to choose for herself instead of forcing her into some polished version of success they could display at dinners. Then I walked away. Later, Clara approached my table wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked whether I was enjoying the evening. I congratulated her on the ceremony and told her Esteban certainly seemed confident. She lowered her voice and tried once more to frame Lucia's internship as a mistake. I said the subject was not up for debate. Clara sighed and repeated the old argument in a new form. Music is unstable, Adrian. You were fortunate. I repeated the word fortunate back to her because after decades of discipline, sleepless nights, rejection, and relentless work, that word always felt insulting. She looked at me and I realized something sad. Even now, she could not fully admit that I had built something real outside the worldview she had chosen. Mateo interrupted the tension by arriving with fresh champagne, and Clara excused herself. A while later, Mateo leaned toward me and said something that genuinely surprised me. Clara had kept my old grand piano, the one I bought after the divorce, the one that had barely fit into my apartment, the one that symbolized my refusal to quit. Apparently, it now sat in her study. I didn't know what to make of that. People hold on to strange things, Mateo said, then added that Esteban was about to give a speech and that I should pay close attention. He wasn't wrong. Esteban took the microphone, thanked the guests, praised Clara's intelligence and elegance, and then slowly turned the toast into something uglier. Without saying my name at first, he spoke about how some people in life choose the wrong road, how some men hide irresponsibility behind artistic excuses, how some women waste years on men who cannot provide the security they deserve. Every person in that room understood exactly who he meant. The applause at the end was thin and awkward. Clara smiled through it, but I noticed the tightness in her jaw and the color rising along her neck. She was embarrassed, even if she refused to show it openly. By then, I no longer felt hurt. What I felt instead was clarity. Esteban needed to reduce me because the version of me he had invented made him feel larger. Later, while guests drifted toward the dance floor, Lucia dragged me into one dance despite my protests. As we moved to a jazz standard, she told me Esteban was still furious about the internship and had been telling her it was absurd to waste her education on a frivolous industry. I asked what she told him. She grinned and said she would rather create something meaningful than spend her life selling influence. I laughed because that was exactly the kind of answer that would infuriate a man like him. As the song ended, Esteban stepped in with a smile that looked pleasant only from a distance. He said a senior political figure wanted to discuss opportunities with Lucia. She began to refuse, but I calmly said the decision was hers. He snapped that some choices require adult guidance. I answered that he would be surprised by how much I understood. That was when the mask slipped for good. In a voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear, he called me a high school dropout who got lucky with one little tune. Then, emboldened by the alcohol and the audience, he leaned closer and told me I should do everyone a favor and stay away from his wife and his family because my presence was embarrassing. The room around us went quiet in that subtle way expensive rooms do, where people pretend not to listen while hearing every word. I looked at him calmly, and in that moment, I understood exactly why Clara had chosen him. He represented everything she once thought mattered most. Status, certainty, polish, public respectability. Then I answered him in an even voice. You know what's really embarrassing, Esteban? Keeping more than 11 billion pesos at your wife's bank while standing here and listening to you prove why that may be a terrible business decision. His face went still. He actually blinked as if his mind had refused the sentence the first time. I went on, just as calmly, and said I had been considering moving the funds for months anyway, but had left the account there out of old respect for Clara. Since it was now clear that respect did not flow in both directions, I would begin transferring the money first thing after the weekend. Absolute silence spread around us. Clara appeared at Esteban's side, pale now, asking me to discuss this privately. I said there was nothing private to discuss. Esteban had said exactly what he meant, and I had responded exactly as I meant to. You could almost see the math racing through his head as the truth settled in. Who I was, how badly he had misread me, and how many of the people watching now understood that he had just insulted one of the bank's most valuable clients at his own wedding. The whispers started immediately. Conversations broke apart and reformed into urgent little circles. Mateo arrived beside me, barely containing his delight, and muttered that the bank chairman looked as if someone had set fire to his year-end bonuses. Esteban tried to recover with talk of a misunderstanding. I asked him which part had confused him, that I was successful, or that the supposed failed musician had more money parked in the institution than he had ever imagined. Several guests looked away to hide their amusement. Lucia stood a few steps off, openly satisfied. Esteban hissed that this was not the place for such a discussion, and I pointed out that he had seemed perfectly comfortable humiliating me publicly until he realized the cost. Clara put a restraining hand on his arm before he could say anything even more foolish, and the two of them withdrew to begin what was clearly urgent damage control. The band started playing again, too brightly, the way musicians do when they are told to save the atmosphere of a room that can no longer be saved. At that point, I decided to leave. My reason for coming had already been fulfilled, though not in the way I expected. Mateo tried to persuade me to stay because, as he put it, the true collapse was only beginning. He said the bank executives were huddled together like men facing a natural disaster. I told him I had made my point and didn't need to linger. As I waited for the elevator, I heard quick footsteps behind me. It was Clara. Away from the reception lights and the eyes of guests, she looked suddenly tired. She asked if I was really leaving. I said I had stayed long enough. Then she asked the question that had clearly been burning in her mind all evening. Were you already becoming this successful when we were still together? I gave her a sad smile and said no, not yet, but I had always been this determined. The elevator doors opened, and for a second it felt as if 20 years of unfinished conversation stood between us and the silence that followed. She asked whether moving the money was really necessary. I told her it wasn't a threat. It was a business decision informed by what I had just learned. She smoothed her dress absently and said Esteban didn't know me the way she did. I interrupted her gently and told her that was the point. She didn't know me anymore either. She had spent years maintaining a story in which I remained the unstable artist she had wisely left behind. If my path had turned out to be valid on its own terms, then maybe the values she had built her life around were not as absolute as she wanted to believe. She didn't deny it. When I asked why she had never told Esteban the truth about my career, about the award, the company, any of it, she looked away and admitted that it complicated the story. Your story, I said. She stayed silent. Finally, she said we had wanted different lives and that this much, at least, had always been true. I agreed. From inside the reception hall, we could hear raised voices, one of them unmistakably Esteban's, followed by the sharper tone of an older man I assumed was one of the bank's senior executives. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Then she asked what I would do about the account. I thought about it honestly. The truth was I had kept a large portion of my money there, partly out of inertia and partly because some old thread of connection to Clara had never been fully cut. Neither reason was strong enough anymore. I told her I would move most of it, but not all. I would leave enough to make clear I was not trying to destroy her professionally. This was not about punishing her. Relief flashed across her face, followed by something more difficult to name. Gratitude, maybe. Shame, maybe. Then she told me something I did not expect. Sometimes, she said, when one of my scores appeared in a film, she recognized it before the credits. She said there was a signature in my work she could still hear. That admission caught me off guard. When I asked whether she had been following my career, she answered, from a distance. Then, with a frankness that felt strangely refreshing after so many years, she said it would have been easier if I had failed. I laughed softly and told her I had never been much for the easy route. To my surprise, she laughed too. It was a real laugh, not the polished one she used in public. Lucia appeared at the end of the corridor then, checking whether everything was all right. Clara stepped back into herself immediately and said I was already on my way out. I congratulated her sincerely on the marriage, because despite everything, I never wanted her misery. Lucia rode down with me and joined me in the car. For a while she said nothing, then finally admitted that the look on Esteban's face when I mentioned the account had been worth every awkward family dinner she might suffer through for years. I told her I hadn't intended to create a spectacle, and she gave me a look that suggested she didn't believe that entirely. Then she asked whether her mother had known just how successful I had become. I said I wasn't sure. Lucia hesitated, then told me she had once found one of my earliest major awards hidden in Clara's desk drawer. Clara had slammed the drawer shut when asked about it. That unsettled me more than I expected. I had pictured Clara dismissing my accomplishments, not keeping evidence of them in secret. People are complicated, I said at last. Even parents. When we reached my building, Lucia stayed seated for another minute and confessed that she had been thinking about postponing law school. I turned to face her fully and asked what she wanted instead. Music production, she said. She told me the internship at my studio had made her realize she was genuinely good at it and, more importantly, that she loved it. Esteban hated the idea. I asked what Clara thought. Lucia seemed surprised and then said that, according to her mother, she should speak to me because I would understand that kind of choice better than she would. That answer warmed something in me. Even after all these years, Clara still knew that there was one thing I could give our daughter more naturally than she could: permission to choose an uncertain life if it felt true. I told Lucia law school would still exist later if she wanted it, but passion does not always wait patiently while people make safe decisions. If music production lit something in her, then that fire was worth following, especially because it was risky. Security can keep you comfortable, I told her, but it rarely makes you feel fully alive. She hugged me hard. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the message and laughed. Apparently Esteban was in full damage control mode, and the bank chairman was furious. I winced and said I hadn't meant for it to go that far. Maybe not, she said, but sometimes karma finds very efficient delivery systems. 3 months passed. Autumn slipped into winter, and one evening, while I was working late in my studio, Clara called. We had barely spoken since the wedding except for a brief, professional exchange about the fund transfers. I had kept my word and moved most of the money while leaving enough behind to prove I wasn't acting out of petty revenge. When I answered, her voice was neutral, carefully arranged. She said the bank was hosting its annual Arts Foundation dinner the following month and wanted me to be the keynote speaker. I genuinely thought I had misheard. She explained that the event theme was unconventional paths to success and that, yes, it had been her idea. I asked what Esteban thought of that. There was a pause, and then she told me they were taking time apart. I said I was sorry, and I meant it. She sounded almost surprised by that. Then she admitted the wedding disaster had only exposed problems already there. Esteban, it turned out, had wanted a decorative wife who supported his ambitions, not a powerful executive with her own opinions and authority. I told her that was his loss. Then she said something else I never expected. Lucia had shown her a portfolio of her music production work, and Clara had decided to support her in delaying law school. She said that sometimes the less conventional road is the right one after all. I nearly dropped the phone. She told me not to sound so shocked, that she was still capable of growth. I agreed to speak at the foundation dinner, and when she asked about my fee, I told her to consider it a favor between two people with a very long history. After we hung up, I sat at the piano and found myself playing a melody I had written years earlier, soon after the divorce. Back then it had started as something dark and grieving, but over time it had turned into something steadier, something unexpectedly hopeful. A few minutes later, Lucia texted me asking whether I realized how full circle the entire thing had become. I smiled because she was right. I had gone to that wedding expecting nothing good, maybe just closure, maybe just discomfort. Instead, I found something far more valuable than revenge. I found peace with the past, pride in the life I had built, and confidence that staying loyal to myself had never been the mistake others believed it was. Some people would call what happened revenge. The dropout becoming the featured speaker. The failed musician becoming the success story. The dismissed ex-husband leaving a room full of financiers speechless. But that isn't how I see it. Revenge is about trying to wound someone back. This was something else. This was life, patient and exact, finally playing the score it had been composing for years. If the story hit you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Because sometimes the best comeback isn't planned at all. Sometimes it just arrives when the people who underestimated you finally learn your real name.